Creepy tunnels and caves, a sinister castle, werewolves, vampires, ghouls, witches, and a walking aircraft engine? Or what about this deformed baby fetus? Well, hello and welcome everyone to this new video on Jekyll Productions. Today we're going to delve into the genius horror of Resident Evil Village. It has been almost a year since Resident Evil Village was released, May the 7th, 2021, so it's fitting to rediscover this amazing game, especially when thinking about the horror of this game. It has been a while since I've posted a video, and I have two reasons for this. One, a busy work schedule, and two, playing a lot of Elden Ring. A follow-up video of my previous Elden Ring video essay will come very soon, so stay updated, subscribe, like, and click the notification bell to learn more about film and video games in relation to religion and philosophy, and the use of horror and the grotesque. So, back to Resident Evil Village. I want to talk about its use of horror, and I will explain why I consider the horror within this game and the use of this genre and the various subgenres as multidimensional and genius. So, let's delve into the horror of Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village was released on May the 7th in 2021, and it is a follow-up of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. And once again you play as Ethan Winters. This time, players not exploring the Baker residence in Louisiana, but are on European soil, an old and sinister village in Romania. Ethan Winters tries to live a happy and peaceful life with his wife Mia and 6-month-old daughter Rosemary in Romania, which they obviously deserve after the traumatic events in Resident Evil 7. However, things go sour when Chris Redfield, an important character of previous Resident Evil installments, and this man kill Mia and kidnap Rosemary. So Ethan is taken hostage and is taken away in a van. A strange accident occurs, or worse than an attack. The driver is dead, and now it's up to Ethan to find his daughter and to uncover why and what is going on. This leads him to the village. The village has been invaded by werewolf creatures called lycans and is essentially surrounded by 4 different domains governed by 4 different lords. The castle players notice in the distance is one of these domains or strongholds, and here resides the aristocratic vampire lady Alcina Dimitrescu with her 3 daughters. And all this is very similar to Dracula. Then you have the mention of Donna Benefiento, who is a ghost-like figure using puppets and a very scary monstrosity to do her bidding. Salvatore Moreau is a fishman who operates from his reservoir. And lastly you have science genius Carl Heisenberg, who works from his factory where he is building an army of super soldiers. As said before, these lords control the village, and the villagers that still live within the scary town are either praying to these lords as if they are gods, or they have taken shelter. Some even fight against the controlling forces without luck. However, these 4 lords do listen to the supreme leader called Mother Miranda. The villagers are aware of the omnipresence of Mother Miranda, which is also why they worship her as the highest. Ethan Winters has to progress through all these 4 areas in order to confront Mother Miranda, who is responsible for his daughter's kidnapping. Now that we all have a sense of the story of Resident Evil Village, we can cover the horror of this game. Resident Evil Village corresponds very well with different subgenres of horror and genres that are linked to horror, namely Gothic Horror, Supernatural Horror, Lovecraftian Horror, Cosmic Horror, Techno Horror, and the grotesque. Yes, Gothic Horror is the most obvious category of horror in Resident Evil Village. The eerie village with the various lycan creatures and the Dracula-esque castle in the background. And of course the resident of this castle, Lady Dimitrescu, and her 3 daughters and their servants. The village itself is a perfect balance of a contemporary look, be it somewhat shabby, combined with Victorian-era buildings and statues. You have the old mansions, churches, tombstones, and walls and gates, which are clear examples of this. Also the implementation of murals and other forms of pictorial art, together with scarecrows, goat heads, and flying crows, adds to the sense of Gothic horror. The fact that most of its villagers are dressed in more historical garbs also adds to this. The monsters that we encounter here are Gothic through and through. You have the werewolves, some in size similar to a normal human being, All is enormous, and some have almost lost all their human features and look like wolf monsters. Now let's continue to Castle Dimitrescu. The building itself is on the outside very similar to Dracula's castle, especially the snowy main gate. The interior of the castle also seems to be inspired by Dracula's castle, and parts of the interior and exterior are in medieval and Victorian era style, and also has many secret corridors, dungeons and attics. The main rooms of the castle have a very aristocratic vibe to it, a combination of Baroque and Victorian era art and architecture. The dungeons juxtapose this aristocratic atmosphere, and similar to depictions and descriptions of Dracula's castle, the Dimitrescu castle also has a medieval dungeon. This connects very well with the Gothic horror genre, knowing that the genre is grounded in the ruins of the past, both literally and figuratively. Linda Bayer-Berenbaum also discussed this in a work from 1982 titled The Gothic Imagination. She explains that ruins and the past in general are very important for Gothic horror. Gothic ruins create a unique atmosphere related to fearful emotions. Ruins, together with distorted historical environments, confronts the reader or viewer, or in this case of Resident Evil, a player, with the decay and collapse of human creations. By placing a story in a Gothic environment, such as the Dimitrescu castle, this gives a sense of awe, which connects very well to the sublime, as understood by Edmund Burke. And this is something I've covered in one of my previous videos about Gothic and cosmic horror in Bloodborne. I highly recommend you to watch that video as well if you haven't done so. Placing a story in a Gothic environment also suggests that the story itself is still connected to the past, as if it's still being part of the long-lost past. The story of Dracula is an excellent example of this. You have here the vampiric count who existed for many ages, an individual of the past whose story somewhat is still relevant and part of the present. In short, in Gothic horror, the past is still a mysterious aspect of the present. This in return gives an impression of isolation or even confusion from the rest of the world. And this is similar to Freud's conception of anxiety, and all this creates a sense of darkness, of mystery. And when looking at the village and the castle in Resident Evil Village, this sense of isolation is omnipresent. Players who explore this Romanian town for the first time are oddly confronted with a sense of familiarity. You have the modern elements, the car, sink, tractor, etc. And this gives the players a sort of reassurance. And at the same time, there are also the unfamiliar and unconventional elements, the odd paintings and symbols, the goat heads, the enormous castle, and other medieval aspects. This juxtaposition creates a distorted familiarity, which results in an uncanny feeling. Uncanny is generally understood as something that is both familiar and deeply strange at the same time. Sigmund Freud followed a long philosophical tradition concerning this. When looking at the creatures in the village and Dimitrescu castle, Gothic horror is probably the first thing that comes to mind. We have the typical werewolves, vampires, ghouls and other scary undead figures in the dungeons. Also the evil yet mysterious witch makes her appearance. In one of my previous videos on the horror of Bloodborne, I also shed light on the subgenre of Gothic medicine. Resident Evil Village also owes much to this genre. Think of all the experiments and experiment notes players can find within the different areas of the village. A Gothic medicine is a style of writing in which the medical advancements of the 19th century are connected to the bizarreness of Gothic horror. Madeline Hood explains that the imagery of the mad scientist and the doctor within Gothic literature is tied close together with the language that was employed in scientific text at the time. Similar to Gothic horror, paranormal or supernatural horror has its roots in the ghost story. As a genre, this form of storytelling has existed probably as long as the existence of humankind. However, as opposed to the Gothic horror genre, supernatural horror is more concerned with the things we cannot really see, or those things we cannot entirely grasp. Think of ghosts, demons, or the afterlife in general. Whereas in Gothic horror, physical monstrosities are more present. And this is also the reason why various supernatural films have a religious element to it. Someone is being haunted by a ghost or demonic force and needs to be saved by a priest. Demonic possession or a curse is therefore a recurring part within the supernatural horror genre. This religious aspect isn't always present in all works of supernatural horror. Matthias Claesen, writer of Why Horror Seduces, gives a quite fitting definition. Supernatural horror involves some kind of suspension or breach of physical law, usually embodied in or caused by some kind of supernatural agency, such as an uncanny monster or a ghost. In Resident Evil Village, the most fitting character would be Donna Beneviento and her doll Angie. Donna is able to create hallucinations within people and communicates exclusively through her doll Angie, and this makes her a sort of ghost-like figure. However, she also connects with the psychological horror genre due to her mental instability and the fact that she isn't really a ghost or a demonic force. This is also one of the many reasons why Resident Evil Village is genius. It blends to a certain extent psychological horror with supernatural horror. However, her ability to create hallucinations and her ability to seemingly be everywhere yet nowhere makes her an excellent example of a villain within the supernatural genre. Most supernatural horror stories and films from the 1940s were set in a haunted house. This setting of a haunted house is an important aspect of supernatural horror. In Resident Evil Village, this is also the case. The Beneviento Mansion is a perfect example of a haunted house, and when players walk up to the estate, it induces a sense of mystery and anxiety, similar to the buildings we see in haunted house movies. What is interesting is that the outside of the building is dilapidated and seems deserted. However, when entering the building, players are confronted with a house that isn't entirely deserted, judging from the candles and the lights. And what makes this part of the game so genius is that, similar to haunted house stories and films, the paranormal or supernatural becomes more present and intense as the story progresses. Once you uncover some of the secrets and puzzles within the house of Beneviento, which also in true haunted house fashion has scary corridors, secret doors and basements, things get more weird and scary. It is this entire tense build-up that makes this part of the game so scary. And of course the horrendous baby fetus. In the supernatural horror genre, this tension and build-up is the most important contributor to this feeling of anxiety. It always forces the audience and or players to ask questions about what is going on. It evokes a form of creativity and mystery by making the audience proactive. While looking at the scary corridor, you are probably wondering if you saw something or not. Or you might be wondering who or what is lurking in the distance. Anyway, Donna Beneviento and Angie are like ghosts, almost never physically tangible, as if they are all-seeing demons or spirits. Yes, Lovecraftian horror, also known as cosmic horror. But why do I think that the Lovecraftian horror genre is present within Resident Evil Village? Well, the entire story essentially revolves around the so-called fungal root. Fungal root is the core of the mysterious mold fungus and functions as an essential entity within these fungus colonies, the mycomycete. We know that there are at least two fungal roots that have existed. The very first was located underneath an ancient megalith called the Ceremony Site and was worshipped as the Black Gold. How old and how the fungal root emerged is unknown. So while progressing the story, we learn that Mother Miranda was once a scientist who researched the fungal root and used the collected mold and turned it into a parasite called cadeau, which is Romanian for gift. And this parasite was used to infect people, turning them into monsters. Except the four lords of the area, although mutated, they kept to a certain degree their sanity and received special abilities. And this is also a typical aspect within the Lovecraftian horror genre, a contemplation of mankind's place in the vast, comfortless universe revealed by modern science, in which the horror springs from the discovery of appalling truth. In Resident Evil Village, this appalling truth is the discovery of the fungal root and its evil and sinister effect on its surroundings and other organisms. Another important aspect of Lovecraftian horror is the naturalistic fusion of horror and science fiction, in which presumptions about the nature of reality are eroded. In Lovecraftian horror, there are also protagonists who have to face unforgiving and inescapable forces. This reduces the human protagonist to incompetent and weak and powerless. This also is to a certain degree the case in Resident Evil Village. However, Ethan Winters is obviously enormously tough and strong throughout the entire game, but at the end of his storyline it is revealed that he is infected with the fungal root, making him a mutant destined to rot away, an inescapable fate at the hands of an ancient and unknown organism of force. Lovecraftian horror is also preoccupied with so-called visceral textures as opposed to humanoid corpses and bones, etc. Such visual textures are also present in Resident Evil Village, especially when thinking about the Cadu or the mold itself, or even better, when thinking about Salvatore Moreau and his reservoir area. Moreau has also been affected by the Cadu parasite, making him a mutated humanoid fish monster. His reservoir is drenched with slime and other juices. So in Techno Horror, there is a focus on how technology can become a force of evil, be it because of technology becoming intelligent and self-aware, or due to the mad scientists who use the self-created technology for evil purposes. This is similar to, for instance, Frankenstein's monster or the Lovecraftian scientist Herbert West. This to some extent makes Techno Horror an extension of Gothic medicine, which is, as you know, about mad scientists conducting experiments in which technology, usually in combination with organisms, play a vital role. In Resident Evil Village, Carl Heisenberg is the first character who comes to mind. The character's name, Carl Heisenberg, already seems to be a reference to the typical idea of the intelligent continental genius of the 19th and early 20th century. Heisenberg is a famous name within the field of neurobiology and chemistry. But anyway, Carl Heisenberg is a genius in engineering and is in charge of the Heisenberg family. He owns the Heisenberg factory. Unlike science fiction horror, in Techno Horror there is a strong emphasis on technology. Technology and the way it has been altered and or used is the core aspect within this genre, whereas in science fiction horror, technology is usually part of the backdrop of the story. The Factory of Heisenberg shows this mad fusion of traditional horror with technology. We see undead figures who have been altered into technological weapons, especially Storm. This undead creature has a human body with an aircraft engine in place of its torso and head. There are also the Howlers and Soldats, who are undead humans that have been mechanically modified. And Carl Heisenberg itself, in his final form, during the last confrontation, is the amalgamation of both the result of Carl Heisenberg's technological powers and him being mutated thanks to the Cadu parasite. In previous videos I've talked about the grotesque extensively, in particular in my video on the grotesque in the Soulsborne games. So I highly recommend you to watch that video if you haven't done so. Resident Evil Village is a truly grotesque work, in particular when looking at the monsters and some of the characters. Take the Duke for instance, a figure who is enormous in size and seems mostly busy with earthly appetites, eating and smoking cigars. It's really the stereotype of a fat Duke. And as Mikhail Bakhtin puts it, the material bodily principle is contained in the people, a people who are continually growing and renewed. As I've explained in my video on the grotesque, Bakhtin argues that the grotesque concerns the earthly aspects, the lower bodily stratum. This relates to the idea of degradation. To degrade also means to concern oneself with the lower stratum of the body, the life of the belly and the reproductive organs. The Duke's belly is bursting out of his clothes, and this is a clear example of the grotesque within this game. Players are eventually confronted by grotesque monsters. Lady Dimitrescu transforms into a horrendous dragon-like creature. And in the house of Benefiento, Donna Benefiento unleashes a giant, deformed and horrendous baby fetus. It still gives me the chills. Salvatore Moreau is himself already grotesque, but during the final boss fight with him, he changes into even more of a monstrosity. And Carl Heisenberg's final form is truly grotesque, completely unrecognizable and destructive. As Mikhail Bakhtin puts it, the grotesque image reflects a phenomenon in transformation, an as yet unfinished metamorphosis. Also, Geoffrey Harpin's take on the grotesque and temptations fits very well with the monstrosities within Resident Evil Village. Temptations are grotesque not only because they are hideous, but because in the midst of an overwhelming impression of monstrosities, there's much we can recognize. Much corrupted or shoveled familiarity. 3 of the 4 lords and the baby fetus are also an example of corrupted familiarity and an example of unfinished metamorphosis. Lady Miranda's transformation during the final boss battle is also an example of an unfinished metamorphosis and corrupted familiarity. So what makes Resident Evil Village so unique is that its story and entire design has allowed the use of the different kinds of horror. So you have the Gothic, supernatural, Lovecraftian and Techno, together with the grotesque. This fusion and blending of the different horror genres as a result of the entire narrative and design creates a unique and intense horror experience. And usually horror films and games remain within one branch of the genre, but the story of Resident Evil Village has allowed for an unusual path, yet one that is extremely versatile and therefore visually and atmospherically very unique. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more on Jackal Productions.